I never believed in ghost stories. I was always the kind of person who looked for logical explanations for strange things. But after that night, something inside me changed. My grandmother died 6 months ago, and as her only heir, I inherited her old house in the countryside. It was an old building, full of dark wooden furniture and antique objects accumulated over decades, a relic from another time. Since I needed to sell the house, I decided to spend a weekend there packing her things and cleaning everything before putting it on the market. I spent the first day in silence, packing her belongings with a strange mix of nostalgia and sadness. It was hard to imagine that I would never see my grandmother sitting in that worn-out armchair by the window again, where she used to knit. The house had a heavy atmosphere, not of fear, but of absence, as if time had stopped since she passed away. That night, however, things began to change. I was upstairs, tidying the room that used to belong to my grandfather, when I heard a noise coming from the basement, a dry creak, like something had fallen or moved down there. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to calm myself. Old houses make noises, I thought. It could be the wind, or maybe a rat in the walls. Still, I decided to go down and check. The basement door was in the kitchen, and I barely ever opened it when I was there. I always hated that place. It was dark, with a low ceiling and a musty smell that clung to your clothes. I turned on the stairway light and went down, the steps creaking under my feet. When I got to the bottom, I looked around. Old boxes were stacked up, and some rusty tools were scattered on the floor. Nothing seemed out of place, except for one thing. In the far corner, there was a mirror, large, with an ornate golden frame. I didn't remember it being there before. I approached it, examining it. The glass was cloudy, dirty with age, and the frame looked worn, as if it had been ignored for years. A feeling of discomfort washed over me, but I decided that the mirror couldn't stay there when someone came to look at the house. I grabbed a cloth and started cleaning it. That's when I noticed something strange. My reflection was there, as expected, but in the background, in the mirror, there was a shadow. It shouldn't have been there. The corner reflected was empty, in the real basement. I felt the blood freeze in my veins, and slowly, I turned to look behind me. Nothing. Just the empty, dark basement. I took a deep breath and looked back at the mirror. The shadow was still there, but now it seemed sharper, as if it was coming closer to me through the glass. My heart raced. I stepped back, but something inside me told me not to take my eyes off the mirror. The shadow kept moving, slowly and deliberately, until it stopped right behind my reflection. There was no face, no clear form, just a dark blur that seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. The air around me became thick, and I could barely breathe. I was paralyzed, unable to look away from the mirror. That's when it moved again, and this time, it smiled. A grotesque and distorted smile that appeared in the reflection, even without a mouth or face. I ran up the stairs so fast I nearly tripped, slamming the basement door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely think straight. I tried to convince myself it was an illusion, that I was tired, too stressed with cleaning and the memories of my grandmother. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I spent the rest of the night locked in the bedroom, lights on, refusing to go back downstairs. I needed to get out of that house, but the fear of crossing paths with the mirror again kept me there. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow smiling. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. I decided not to sell the house. I couldn't, not after what happened. But before I left, I locked the basement door and nailed the edges, as if that would be enough to stop whatever it was from coming out. I never went back. But sometimes, I still feel like I'm being watched, especially on dark nights when I catch my reflection in a mirror. And it's always the same smile, waiting for me to look for too long. I've always loved nighttime walks. There's something deeply serene about the darkness that envelops everything. The muffled sound of footsteps on damp earth, and the shadows dancing in the trees under the moonlight. It was my way of escaping the routine, losing myself in thoughts while the silence of the forest embraced me. That night, however, I found something that made me question whether the tranquility of the dark is really as safe as it seems. The trail was the same as always, a well-marked path winding through the dense forest. The wind blew gently, rustling the leaves of the trees. Everything was as it always had been, until I heard it. A melody. Faint and distant, almost like a whisper, carried by the wind. It was sweet and soft, but there was something profoundly wrong about it. Each note seemed to hesitate, as if the singer was numb, trapped in an old and restless dream. I stopped, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but it seemed to float around me, directionless. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was alone, or at least I should have been. There were no houses or cabins nearby, no campsites. It was impossible for someone to be out there, singing in the middle of the forest at that hour. Yet the song continued, insistent, calling. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the sound. The melody, though disturbing, had something hypnotic about it. Each step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the forest, farther from the trail I knew so well. The trees seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching in strange ways. The wind, once gentle, now carried a biting cold that made me shiver. After walking for some time, I came upon a clearing I had never seen before. In the center, there was a small stone structure. It looked ancient, as if it had been there for centuries, hidden from the view of anyone who passed nearby. The song was louder now, coming from inside the structure, its echoes resonating through the clearing. I walked up to the entrance, a wooden door slightly ajar, creaking at the slightest touch. Inside it was dark, except for a faint bluish light emanating from something in the center of the room. My heart raced when I saw what it was. A mirror. But it wasn't an ordinary mirror. Its surface glowed with a spectral light, and its frame was made of twisted branches and moss-covered stones. The sound, the song, was coming from inside it. It was as if the mirror itself was singing. I approached it slowly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end with each step. The melody grew louder, more insistent, and then I realized something terrible. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. There was a figure there, a woman with long disheveled hair and empty eyes. She was singing, her lips moving slowly, as if each word was a lament trapped in time. I tried to step back, but something held me in place. I couldn't stop looking. Her voice was inside my head, scratching at the depths of my sanity like invisible claws. The notes of the song warped, becoming sharper, more desperate. And then she stopped singing. She smiled. Her eyes, once empty, locked onto mine, as if she had finally noticed me. She reached out toward the mirror, and my reflection began to distort. The clearing around me faded, replaced by suffocating darkness. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground, as if the forest's roots were holding me in place. I could feel her hand reaching farther, as if it was about to cross through the mirror. Suddenly, a loud sound cracked through the forest, a branch snapping. The connection between us broke, and the spell shattered. I stumbled back, finally able to break free. I ran, not daring to look back, the sound of the song fading as I fled. When I finally reached the trail again, the night was completely silent. The heavy air from before had lifted, and everything seemed to have returned to normal. But I knew I would never be the same again. Now, even on the calmest nights, when I close my eyes, I still hear that song. It calls me back to the forest, to the mirror and the woman who waits, still smiling, eager for someone to listen to her melody. And I fear the day when I won't be able to resist. When my sister and I inherited our parents' old house, we knew it wouldn't be easy to sell. It was a massive, decaying, Victorian building, long abandoned. The place had a heavy atmosphere, something that seemed to have seeped into the walls over the years. Even so, for sentimental reasons and practicality, we decided to spend a weekend there to catalog some belongings before putting the house on the market. The first night was eerily quiet. The wind blew through the cracked windows, making the curtains flutter like ghosts wandering through the empty rooms. I had forgotten how oppressive that house could feel at night. As I walked down the long hallway, on the upper floor, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. A massive mirror was hanging on the central wall of the hallway. I had spent my childhood there and had no memory of that mirror. It was old, with a carved wooden frame, worn by time, and the glass surface was slightly foggy, as if time had left its mark on it. I asked my sister if she remembered it, but she shook her head, just as surprised as I was. Maybe it was from our grandparents, she suggested, not giving it much thought. During the day, we kept ourselves busy cleaning and packing up old items, but at night, the mirror began to bother me. Every time I passed it, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I avoided looking directly at the reflection, but at some point, I caught a glimpse. Something was wrong. The reflection seemed different. At first, I thought it was a flaw in the mirror's surface, some distortion caused by time. But the more I looked, the more I realized that the hallway reflected in the mirror appeared darker. It was as if the reflection was a slightly different version of what I saw around me. The carpet on the floor seemed more worn, and the shadows along the edges of my vision seemed to move, even if only for a moment. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. Something about it disturbed me deeply, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, dragging, as if someone was walking down the hallway. I jumped up and went to the bedroom door, opening it just enough to peek into the dark corridor. There was nothing. The house was silent, except for the faint echo of the wind outside. But the footsteps continued. They were coming from the mirror. Chills ran down my entire body. I reached out and turned on the hallway light. The mirror was there, in the same spot, reflecting the soft glow of the yellowish bulb, but something was moving inside it. I approached it, hesitant, my heart racing. In the reflection, I saw a figure. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my sister's. It was someone, or something, that shouldn't have been there. A pale woman, with long, disheveled hair, wearing a dirty white dress, stood at the far end of the reflected hallway. Her head was tilted to the side in a strange way, as if her neck was broken, and her eyes were fixed on me. I backed away, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I turned to the real hallway, empty, silent, but in the reflection, she was still there. Then slowly, she took a step towards me. I screamed, stumbling backward. My sister ran out of her room, asking what had happened. I tried to explain, pointing to the mirror, but when she looked, the woman was gone. Everything looked normal, but I knew what I had seen. My sister thought I was just tired, that the stress of being back in that house was getting to me. We tried to forget about the incident and went to bed, but sleep never came. I stayed up all night, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting to hear those footsteps again. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I told my sister we needed to leave, to sell the house as soon as possible. She hesitated, but agreed. Before we left, though, she went upstairs to grab a few things. I waited in the car, eager to leave that place behind. That's when I heard her scream. I ran back into the house and up the stairs. My sister was standing in the hallway, staring at the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. "What's wrong?" I shouted, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on the reflection. Slowly, I moved closer. In the mirror, the woman was back, but this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her was my sister. Not her reflection, but a distorted version of her, pale, wearing the same dirty dress, with her neck twisted. They were both smiling, their heads grotesquely tilted. The real sister beside me started trembling, unable to tear her eyes away. Suddenly, I felt something pulling on my arm, her reflection, the distorted version, trying to drag me inside. With all the strength I could muster, I pulled my sister away from the mirror, and we ran out of the house without looking back. We left everything there, the house, the furniture, the mirror,